A beginner's guide to OpenID. This is the theme. Everything I tell in this talk, take with a grain of salt because I'm not an expert. I knew nothing about how this works 2 months ago. So this is just what I learned in these times, just as a disclaimer. So what was our starting point? And I come to that, what OpenID is later. So I'm mainly developing futuLog these days, a service you probably all know that is used to log in if you go to the office. It's the general infrastructure is we have like futuLog, and it talks to a normal Postgres database. futuLog itself is written in Haskell, and it is deployed using a simple Docker container. Postgres sits in Amazon RDS, so I don't need to care about backups and all that stuff. In fact, there's a bit more, so that's where you come in. A request now doesn't directly hit futuLog. There is I think it's an Apache web server. I'm not sure about this because there's also something that I don't do myself. So instead of just hitting futuLog directly, it hits the Apache and it redirects you to FUM, so login.futurist.com, that you probably all know, which is the old login system that Futurice has. So then it logs you in, and after that, it will forward you to futuLog. That way, in the beginning, we didn't need to care about logging you in. That was all done by the infrastructure. And in fact, this infrastructure is called playswarm. It's something that IT offers for everyone here at Futurice. So if you go to play.futurist.com, you can see how you can use it for yourself to deploy anything. And you can decide if you want to have this authentication or not. A little bit has changed. We come to that later. So that is the starting point. So now the thing was two things. First, FUM is getting sunsetted. So everyone is moving to Okta now because that's like the new login service that we use for everything for single sign-on. And the second point is we want to open source futuLog at some point, so others can use it too. So that in that case, it has to be possible to deploy that thing without relying on Futurice infrastructure. So we need to somehow get rid of the reliance of this Apache web server. The solution, there were two ways we could go. First, we wait until IT makes futuEKS, which is the new version of futuSwarm or playswarm available. But the problem with this, there were two problems. The first, the timeline was not clear. There were like a demo available at some point, but the database wasn't implemented yet. So the database RDS is also managed by a script. So I don't need to care about this. This is done by IT. The timeline was not clear, and again, we want to open source it. So then just relying on another piece of Futurice infrastructure wouldn't have helped that well. So I decided to just bite the bullet and figure out how to talk to Okta directly in futuLog itself. I knew there was something like that was called OpenID Connect. In fact, in first, I only knew there was something called OpenID. And OpenID is not the same thing as OpenID Connect, because OpenID Connect is the new version of OpenID, which makes total sense, especially because OpenID, the latest version of OpenID, is 2.0, and OpenID Connect is 1.0. So this is not confusing at all. But yeah, OpenID Connect is the newest thing that should everyone use. Okay, I knew it was possible to authenticate with OpenID Connect, and that it is an open protocol, that it's supported by at least Okta and all the other services. So it should be fine for open sourcing, because if your identity provider doesn't talk OpenID, you should get a new provider. So what is OpenID Connect? At the basics, it's just a specification. You see also here, how is it different from OpenID 2.0? So yeah. Naming, please, people, name your stuff better. So it's just a specification on how requests have to be structured to authenticate, and it's supported by all the major identity provider. I have put a few examples up here. So Okta is the one we use at Futurice, and the one in the middle is Keycloak, which is an open source service that I use in futuLog for local testing. So for local testing, I just have a Docker Compose file that spins up a Keycloak server and futuLog. So futuLog talks to Keycloak to log in a few test users. And the last one's OneLogin. I never use it, but they have the best documentation about this. So that's the other thing. Keycloak documentation about OpenID is garbage. Okta documentation, not that helpful either. OneLogin, pretty good, but you won't get around it to not reading the spec. So there is like a few parts of the spec. You see here all the links down there. These are different parts of the spec. Like the only important thing is core. This is one everyone has to support. All the other specifications are optional additions to that. So the one we will use later is this one too. This is the discovery, which makes it possible to dynamically detect where to, like, which are the endpoints to talk to. And relying party initiated login. Just for some terminology, Okta in OpenID language is the identity provider, and futuLog as the server is the relying party, and you are the user. So that's the three terminologies. So Okta is the identity provider, futuLog is the relying party, short RP. So relying party initiated logout. So I don't know if you know, but in futuLog there's a logout button, and I wanted to make sure that this continues to work. So that's why we use this. So how does this protocol work? That took some time to figure out. There's a really good site, OpenID Explained, that goes over the basics, but I think I have managed to cram enough animations in the next slide to make it clear. So if we go back to that architecture diagram and remove everything that is not really interesting for the authentication. So we want to get a new player in the field, and that is Okta, and replace FUM with it. So that also makes this Apache server irrelevant for our cases. So we are just with these three players. Let's arrange this a bit different. Okay, so first, you as a client make just a normal request to futuLog. This is when you have never logged in, so you don't have a login from futuLog. futuLog sees, hey, you're not giving me my authentication data, and sends you a redirect to Okta in this case. And specifically, it sends you something like this. So some endpoint from Okta that is responsible for authorization. Then response type code. This is something that's called the authorization code flow. There are different, like in the OpenID specification, there are different means to authenticate. There's the authorization code flow, there's the implicit flow, and I think there's also a hybrid flow. I just know from some talks I've seen, don't use the implicit flow because it's old, outdated, and insecure. And it was just needed when there was no CORS, so cross-origin requests. But now there is CORS, so this is fine. Usually it goes like this: use the authorization code flow unless you know what you're doing. So that's exactly what I did. And this response type code is exactly what triggers this authorization code flow. Then there's a typo from my side, but you need a client ID, because every client, so a client in this case is futuLog, needs to be pre-registered with Okta. So in our case, I talked to IT, and they set up a new app in Okta for futuLog, and then they gave me this client ID. A redirect URI, this also needs to be pre-registered, so that, because this is where Okta will send a code. So if there wouldn't be a pre-registered URL, you as an attacker could just ask Okta, hey, send me a code to this. Or worse, if you have something like there was an issue with Facebook at some point where someone could have some code running on a custom Facebook site, and then if a user logged in, Facebook would send to any URL the code. So the attacker owning this Facebook this site could just take the code and log in as you. So this is important that this is, first, it's a static URL. There's no wildcards allowed. And second, it needs to be pre-registered with the identity provider. Nonce is just there to make replay attacks. This is basically a random value. State, I'm not sure, but I think it is a random value, but it will be important later. And scope is what information you want in the ID token, which we also see later. So this is the whole request that we sent back to the browser as our response. So this is request and response. We don't talk to Okta directly at that point. So the browser then sees, okay, I forgot. First, how do we get this special endpoint? Remember when I talked about the discovery? This is basically the first step. Like when starting up, futuLog checks this URL for the configured OpenID provider. So that is a JSON document that contains all the endpoints and all the which methods of authentication are available with that provider. So this makes it really easy for futuLog or the library I use to discover like which is the capabilities of that provider. So that's basically the zero step. That's where this OAuth the authorized endpoint comes from. Okay, so we sent a response back with a 302 redirect. And so the browser redirects to Okta. So then you get this Okta login form. And this is the important thing. Like you don't like your login, your password and email, your email and password never touches futuLog and any other service that uses this. You will always only directly talk to Okta when you log in. This is the important bit. So you don't share your password with anyone else. Then Okta sends you back with the code, and in particular, it sends back to this redirect URI. So it will. So you go back to futuLog at that point. Code. This is again just some random base64 string, and state is the same as before, so that they can be connected back when doing the authentication. So this state right down here is the same as the state returned by Okta. Then again, Okta, so then the browser redirects back. So we have then this /return call from the browser. And at that point, we actually talk directly to Okta because this code we get, this random base64, is not useful at all. It's just the only use of this code is for the 6th step. We then trade this code for tokens. And the tokens is the ones we actually want. So there are 3 tokens we get. Again, only one of this is necessary because the specification is very optional. So the only token that you have to get is an authentication token. Those are only valid for about like 10 minutes. And those are you can log into. But after 10 minutes, they're invalid and they won't be accepted anymore. Then usually you also get a refresh token. Those are valid for much longer, and they can be used to refresh new authentication tokens. So they should be held much more secure than those authentication tokens because the impact is much longer. Like after 10 minutes, if some attacker gets this, he has only 10 minutes at maximum to do malicious stuff. With a refresh token, he can request new ones. So these should be kept safe. And the last one is the ID token. So that contains the actual personal information that we want. For example, in futuLog, we get the email address of the person and the full name to display in the UI. In theory, this would also contain the profile picture, or at least an URL with the profile picture, but how it works for Futurice at the moment, this is not the case. That's also why at the moment there are no profile pictures anymore in futuLog, because IT hasn't created a new way of getting profile pictures for everyone. But yeah, that's the core here, how it works. That's if you have a fresh login. If you have an existing login, at that point, I had these 3 tokens, and I wasn't sure, okay, what to do with them now. So I make use of the futu hivemite and asked, what should I do with those tokens? And through a bit of discussion, and main reason was I didn't want to implement my own session management. So I just wanted to reuse the session. If you log out of Okta, you should also be logged out of futuLog and so on. So if you log into Okta, you're also logged into futuLog. That was easiest accomplished by just sending back this authentication token in a cookie and saving those 3 tokens in the database. That way, the refresh token never leaves futuLog. So that's kept safe. And you can use the authentication token in this request as cookie. And the cookie is obviously HTTP only and only over secured connection and so on and so on. No JavaScript, the classic cookie protection stuff. So then a existing login, again, we of course do the discovery first. You request with the cookie now. Then either the cookie, like the auth token is still valid. So it's less than 10 minutes since the last request. Then we just serve the content and everything's fine. So we have as I said, I saved the authentication token in the database and with its expiration. So if someone sends a request, I can check, hey, this token is already in the database. Is it still valid? If yes, return data. If not, then we use that refresh token to talk to Okta again, get a new auth token, and then set a new token and return our content. If this request fails, so if Okta denies us, for example, because the user was logged out or the refresh token was revoked for some reason, then we would just redirect you and you would go through all of this again. So that's how the code flow in general works. So now what did not work? Because of course it didn't. Step 0, discovery. This was the first thing. Before startup, before doing any of this, I want to get the discovery document and check what is supported by the identity provider. Keycloak and Okta both support this, so that's not the issue. The issue was this here. This is the SSL report for the TLS certificate of okta.futurist.com. And you see here, this server certificate chain is incomplete, grade capped to B. The TLS certificate that is used on this domain is not a completely valid TLS certificate. This is not a problem in the browser because for some reason the browser accepts this, but it is a problem if you try to use curl, but also not always. Some people on Macs have maybe an older curl or a different certificate store, but for some people on Mac, so I think Patrick tried it on, or Yussi, I don't know, tried it on a Mac and it worked, but on my Linux, it didn't work. Also in the container in the Linux, it didn't work with curl, and it also didn't work with the Haskell library I used. So as already in the comments, the solution here is to get that missing certificate and put it into the trust store of the container, which is, again, needed some startup script that takes the mounted certificate, puts it in the store, and then starts the server. It was managed by debugging this. Huge thanks to Yussi. I would have never guessed this myself, but he mentioned this, that there was some issues with the certificate, and that made it possible to debug. Because that was when I moved from locally, it worked with Keycloak, to then moving to staging to try it with the real Okta. Okay, first thing. Second thing was trading this code for tokens. It was a minor thing. So to trade this code, you need to log into, to authenticate against Okta. So only valid or allowed applications that have been pre-registered with Okta are allowed to do this. So not everyone willy-nilly can just get a token from somewhere and a code from somewhere and get tokens. So you need this client ID and also a secret. And the secret is pre-shared. So IT, when I said, hey, can you add futuLog, then this secret will then, IT gave me the secret and the client ID, and then I can use this. So to give this to Okta, there are two possibilities per spec. You can either put them as base64 in the authorization header or as in the post body. The library I used by default was checking if it was supported, but if it was supported, it was using the authorization header, but it also put the client ID in the body. So this is basically, it put username and password in the header and the username additionally in the body. Keycloak had no issue with this when I tested this, but Okta is more picky, so Okta didn't like that. So last thing, bonus round, again, the discovery. Because since then, Futurice has happened, and this was this Tuesday evening, playswarm was replaced with Futurice. This means this is now not backed by a Docker swarm, but by a Kubernetes network. So just how it's hosted. In theory, this does not matter for us. In practice, when Yussi moved over all the configuration from the old playswarm to this new EKS, he did not move this, the secrets, the Docker secrets. And the certificate that I mentioned earlier was in such a secret. So what you saw on Wednesday with the 502 gateway error, this was exactly this. The certificate was missing. futuLog was not able to connect to Okta to get the discovery. And because it wasn't able to connect to the discovery, it didn't start up because, it needs to be able to talk to Okta to log in. Doesn't make sense to start without being able to log in. So it was just retrying to connect to Okta, but without the certificate, this just always failed. So after a bit of debugging, we found that issue. We're able to just add this certificate in, and it worked then. So, but in the beginning, we thought it was maybe some Kubernetes issue. Then, it was not easy to debug. And at that point, thank you for listening. Do you have questions?
Thank you, Jan. That was super. Really nice to see you here. what's going on behind the scenes. We have time for a couple of questions. If somebody wants to ask, just feel free to open your mic and shout out. Seems like you covered everything that people had in their mind.
I forgot one thing that happened. So one thing that also did not work and that also you saw, you maybe got those invalid token errors sometimes when getting to futuLog. I figured now out the reason for that. So that was Okta was protecting itself from a replay attack. So what happens is when redirecting with the code, I talk to Okta to trade the code for tokens. And for some reason, for some clients, the redirect happened twice. So I also traded that code twice. The first time succeeded, but the second time didn't. And because the second time happens after the first, the user saw the result of the second, which was the error. I fixed this issue by just redirecting back to the homepage of futuLog, because the cookie is set and everything worked. So just the redirect works without displaying the error. So that error is now fixed, even though, it's not really. Mika said something about the implicit flow. I can't really say anything about this. I haven't looked into it. And also about the backend-less stuff, I haven't looked into that at all because I have a backend and I write the backend and I don't write the front end. So I wanted to have it all in the backend. Did you consider just redirecting the user to Okta whenever the token expires? I did, but that would always, like the reload for, because most of the stuff, futuLog is an SPA, so most of the requests don't come from a page load or from a link, but just a bunch of requests happening. And if somewhere between half of the requests something happened and then you would get a reload, it would disrupt the experience. So I just fail the request and then in the background reload. So this is easier and it doesn't disrupt the user experience. It would have been possible, so there would not be a new login window because you are still logged into Okta. So you would just get redirect, short load, redirect, and then you're back to Okta. But that every 10 minutes gets annoying. I can tell you why the certificate chain is not there. It was not supported by Okta when I first set it up with Okta. It hints that it might be supported now. Good idea to ping IT to add the full chain. Cool. Yeah. So yeah, the move broke the workaround. If the certificate would be complete, the workaround wouldn't be needed. I will ping them.
Awesome.